So we are going to start with the respiratory system, and we're going to start by taking first a look at the functions of the respiratory system. The respiratory system has three main functions. It is an air distributor, so in other words, it moves air into different locations within the body. It also is responsible for gas exchange. And the last one, which is actually probably the most important one, is that it filters, warms, and humidifies the air that we breathe. So, the respiratory system is made up of a number of different structures. And here's kind of a list of them: the lungs, the diaphragm, the bronchi, the trachea, the larynx, the pharynx, and the nasal cavity. What we are going to do is, we're actually going to pretend that we are taking a breath in. And the order in which we look at these structures is the order in which the air would pass through on the way into the body. Okay, so we're going to trace the passageway that the air would follow coming into our lungs. These are what we are calling the conducting structures of the respiratory system. So the first structure that it passes through is the nose. Okay, so the air enters through the nostrils into our nasal cavity. Lining our nose is the respiratory mucosa, and these are the mucous membranes that actually line the passageway within our nose. Now, this mucosa is actually all along the respiratory tract, so let's talk a little bit about this mucosa because it is very important. This mucosa helps to warm as well as moisten the air. The mucosa are also sticky with the mucus secretions, and that helps to filter the air. On the surface are ciliated cells, and those are those cells with the finger-like hair on them. And what they do is they sweep any contaminated mucus to our throats. And what we do is throughout the day, as we swallow, we're actually swallowing mucus down to our stomach. And that may contain pathogens, dirt, whatever, but our stomach acid actually kills that for us. Now, in the nasal cavity itself, you will find that it's actually two, one on either side, and that is separated by the nasal septum. And that's that little divider line that you can actually see on the skull inside. It divides the nasal cavity in two that way. Now, if you put your finger in your mouth and touch the roof of your mouth, that is what we call the palate. And that separates, that little bone actually separates the nasal cavity from your mouth itself. There is a bony structure part to it that is called the hard palate, and then the back, towards the back of your throat, it's only soft tissue, which is called the soft palate. Now, coming off of the nasal cavity are four sets of paranasal sinuses, and these are small air spaces in the bones of your skull. So let's take a look at those paranasal sinuses. They have three main functions. They help lighten the skull, because if our skull was solid bone, we actually would not be able to hold up our head. They act as resonance chambers for speech. That's one of the ways you can actually tell when people have a stuffy nose, because these paranasal sinuses tend to get clogged with the mucus first, and because we don't talk the way we normally would talk, then we sound a little bit different. And the last function is that they produce mucus, which drains into our nasal cavity. So this is actually where we get that mucus when we feel kind of nasty, and that is our most important job. Okay, sorry about that. So, like we said, there's four sets of paranasal sinuses, and they include the maxillary sinus, which is if you put your fingertips on your cheek and feel your cheekbones, that's the sinus that is actually right behind your cheekbones. Your frontal sinus, which is above your eyebrows, and sometimes those of you who get a sinus headache, that's actually what is giving you problems, is the pressure in your frontal sinus. The ethmoid sinus is a little bit difficult to describe. Basically, if you take a line right down between your nose and eyes, and then between your ear, where that would intersect would be your ethmoid sinus. And then your sphenoid sinus is the center of the base of the skull. So it's kind of towards the back. It's a little bit further. It's not all the way to the back, but it's kind of more in the center of the skull. So Air comes in through the nose, it goes into the nasal cavity, it can go into the paranasal sinuses, and then work its way through the rest of the nasal cavity, because the paranasal sinuses are dead ends. They're not a complete conducting system. They're not a tube. But then the air can actually go down through our pharynx. And our pharynx has three parts. The upper portion is what connects our nasal cavity with our throat, and that is referred to as the nasopharynx. We have the oropharynx. This is the middle portion that connects the mouth and nasopharynx with the passageway in the throat. When you open your mouth and say ah, what you actually are seeing at the back of your throat is the oropharynx. This is a joint food air area, whereas the nasopharynx only contains air. The laryngopharynx is down below the oropharynx, and this is after we have separated out where food would go versus air. And it connects to an area, which is next in line, called the larynx. So as you can see, I can go from just air in the nasopharynx to oropharynx that has a combination to the laryngopharynx where I have just air again. So obviously at some point I need to separate out the food from the air. And how does that happen? Well, there is a structure within our throats called an epiglottis. This is what allows food to go into the esophagus and prevent food from going into the laryngopharynx. It's actually this flap, this muscular flap that goes over the top of the laryngopharynx and the larynx to help keep food particles out. So it's a flap of tissue that closes it off and prevents food from entering. This is a coordinated muscular action that has to take place, and if this fails to function properly, that's when we choke. The larynx is underneath the laryngopharynx. These are known as the vocal cords. The larynx has 8 rings of hyaline cartilage, and if you put your fingers on your throat and feel those vibrations as you talk, but you can also feel the rings of the hyaline cartilage under there. That is actually your larynx, where we typically think of our throat. One of the rings protrudes forward, and it is called the Adam's apple. And that is because when males go through puberty, that ring tends to grow longer or larger as their voices deepen. It becomes much more prominent in males than it does in females. Inside of the larynx are 2 membrane folds. These are what are called the vocal cords, and these are what we push air past and allow to vibrate to produce sound. In the vocal cords, there is a slit-like opening that we call the glottis. As air continues down into our respiratory tract, the next structure is the trachea, and this is typically called the windpipe. This is shorter than most people think. It's actually only about 10 to 12 centimeters long. And that's because we typically think of the area where our larynx is as actually being the trachea, and it's not. The inside of the trachea is lined with ciliated mucosa. These actually beat upward to move the mucus towards the back of the throat so you can swallow or spit it out. This is because sometimes the mucus in this area does end up with some debris in it, and you don't want that debris to end up down in your lungs. It can actually cause some serious infections. The trachea comes down and then it forms a split, and when it splits, the tubes that are produced are called the bronchi. Okay. Each of these bronchi enter the lung at the hilus, which is an indent in the lung itself. The right bronchi is wider, shorter, and straighter than the left-hand side. So, food tends to, or inhaled objects tend to get stuck in here because of that. Because the left-hand one actually has to take a sharper turn to go around the heart to get to the left lung. So objects, when they're coming in, they're going to tend to follow gravity. And if you're going straighter down rather than making a sharp turn, that's why objects that get inhaled tend to get stuck in that right bronchus. Now, after the bronchi enter the lungs, they start to branch into smaller tubes called bronchioles. And then these bronchioles continue to branch down smaller and smaller until we reach the air sacs called the alveoli. So once the bronchi enter the lungs, things start to change. Lungs are paired organs that are divided into lobes by fissures. Fissures, remember, are deep grooves, just like what we would find in the brain. Now, the left lung in humans has 2 lobes, but the right has 3, and you'll see that on the diagram. The lungs lie in the thoracic cavity, which is also lined by the membrane, and there is a fluid between the membrane and the lungs which allows them to slide underneath the ribs during breathing, and this fluid is called pleural fluid, which goes along with the name of the membrane, which is the pleura. Now, we talked about the bronchioles, but we didn't talk that much about the alveoli. The alveoli actually represent bunches of grapes. These are air sacs, and on top of the air sacs are capillaries. This is the only site where gas exchange can actually take place. The entire rest of the lung, other than the bronchioles, is elastic connective tissue. And what this does is it actually allows the expansion of the lungs as we breathe in. The lungs are covered with a thin membrane that is called the visceral pleura. So that's kind of the conducting system of the heart, or of the lungs, the respiratory system. So what I want to do is actually want to take you to the next video in which we will go through our diagrams.